So they find that 500 kilotons of boat traffic, or an increase of 500 kilotons of boat traffic, which is about the daily average, increases local ozone levels by approximately 60%. So that's, frankly, it's like a pretty large effect. It says, it implies that that sort of the total contribution of boat traffic to ozone levels in Los Angeles is pretty substantial. Is that plausible? I don't know. It could be. So the thing is, like, what you have to realize is that, well, basically, you have to realize the boats are really dirty because they're not. So so California is we're unique in that we're the only state that can set our own pollution, air pollution standards. The reason for that is because we started to try to regulate air pollution before the federal EPA had actually taken similar actions. And so basically courts have decided that since we set precedent to begin with, we can set our own air pollution standards, which can potentially be more stringent than the federal ones. They can't be less stringent because the federal is going to be the baseline that everybody has to adhere to. And then other states, after the federal EPA and California make their decisions, other states have two options. They can either choose the federal standard or they can choose the California standard. So it's basically only two people who can make policy, and each state has one or two choices that they can follow. So California has sort of been very successful at regulating a lot of sources, including automobiles and plants and utilities and stuff that are located within the state. But one thing that they really have no jurisdiction over at all are these boats, because they're coming from basically not so much states, but they're really just coming from other countries. So I don't know all the legal details. Certainly, I'm sure we wouldn't have any jurisdiction. We couldn't hope to have any jurisdiction until they arrive within however many miles of our shoreline. But even after they arrive, we still don't have jurisdiction. I'm not even sure if the federal government has jurisdiction or whether or not it's sort of governed only by international agreements. At any rate, these boats burn very, very dirty fuel and have relatively little emissions control on them because nobody's really regulating them to do so. And it's also the case that just marginal spending or marginal improvements in emissions control equipment can have dramatic impacts on air pollution or air pollution emissions, right? So you can see this with cars, that there's sort of there's kind of like a rule of thumb that something like 90% of all air pollution generated by cars is generated by the 10% of the dirtiest vehicles. And so that's because that's sort of for two reasons. One is that emissions control equipment has gotten much better over time. Also, to the extent that there's some vehicles that theoretically have emissions control equipment that's good, but unfortunately has malfunction or whatever, those also are effectively not controlled even though they technically have the equipment. So if you just if you do install emissions control equipment on most vehicles, it can dramatically lower the level of pollutants, but these boats essentially have nothing installed, and they're burning dirty fuel, and they're also very large. So even though they're very small in number, just because they have no emission control and because they are so large themselves, they end up generating a substantial amount of local air pollution. So that's the effect of boat traffic on air pollution levels, and then of course the second thing that we want to know is how boat traffic affects hospitalization. So the link is presumably running through air pollution levels here. What they find is that 500 kilotons of boat traffic increases local hospitalizations by about 11%. So if you kind of take these two numbers and just do kind of like a rough calculation, you would say that a 10% increase in ozone levels results in approximately maybe a 2% change in respiratory hospitalization. So what I'm doing there is really just taking the 60 and dividing by 11. So there's like for every 5 unit increase in boat traffic, 5% increase in boat traffic, you have about a 1% increase in hospitalizations. So it does turn out that this effect is larger than what you would find if you were just to look at the raw correlation between ozone levels and respiratory hospitalizations. That might be because it's less contaminated with sort of omitted variables bias, or it might be because it doesn't have this avoidance behavior issue that some of the other estimates have. So I think that paper is very nice. And I think that the results are pretty convincing. The only issue, though, with both this paper and with the Ransom and Pope paper is that it's always hard to think about what the impacts of short-term variation in air pollution, or if you see impacts of short-term variations in air pollution on mortality, which is not what this paper is showing. So this paper is looking at hospitalization. But if you were to think about trying to use similar designs to these two papers, to estimate the impacts on mortality, it's very hard to think about, if you were to find a mortality effect, what that would imply about the effect of long-run exposure to air pollution on mortality. So if you find, so let's suppose that you're using these sort of, let's suppose that Moretti and Adele had mortality data instead of the hospitalization data, right? So then they were essentially looking at whether or not mortality was elevated on days when there was very high boat traffic relative to days when there was very low boat traffic, which if we found would presumably be because the high boat traffic days have higher pollution and the low boat traffic days have lower pollution, at least on average. So if they didn't find any relationship there, then you could kind of say, well, that doesn't really change my views about whether or not air pollution has an effect on mortality, just because I don't think that the effect on mortality would occur so rapidly, right? That basically the exposure of just higher pollution levels for a couple of days because there's high boat traffic, I don't think that should really have an impact on mortality. What I think is going to have an impact on mortality is being exposed to high pollution levels for years and years, right? So if you found a null effect, it kind of probably wouldn't end up changing your views that much one way or the other. On the other hand, if you found a significant effect, so let's suppose that they did that, they ran those regressions, had mortality as an outcome, and found that on days with high boat traffic there in fact was a much higher level of mortality. That doesn't actually necessarily imply that mortality or that long-run exposure to air pollution has a negative impact on mortality. And the reason why that's not necessarily the case is that we could think that it just represents what we call harvesting. So this is kind of like a morbid use of the term harvesting, but the basic idea is that we could think that there's sort of weaker individuals in the population, and so let's just say there's people who maybe have heart disease, and so these people are very vulnerable to sort of a variety of negative shocks. They're sort of they're still alive, but if they have any sort of negative or any sort of adverse health shock, they might end up dying. So those shocks could be something like an air pollution spike. It could be something like they end up having to engage in substantial physical exertion on some day. It could be something like they end up getting the flu, which weakens their immune system and causes respiratory issues and so forth. Or any other sort of relatively short-term insult to their health might end up triggering a heart attack, which would kill them, right? So the idea is that essentially, if there's always sort of this pool of sort of weak individuals in the population, I mean, it's not the same individuals, of course, because they're often, by virtue of the fact they're weak, they're often dying off, and then new individuals will enter into this pool. So there's always sort of this pool that's present in the population. Then if you see, say, a short-term spike in air pollution, it may be the case that a bunch of these relatively weak individuals will be killed off, or as the term suggests, harvested. The problem is that if the air pollution spike had not occurred, the same individuals likely would have died soon after, even in the absence of the air pollution spike. So if that's true, then the net effects on life years lost would be minimal. Okay, so like the way that you want to sort of think about it if you were looking at it graphically, and sort of potentially the way that you can also test is like, so let's say this is the mortality rate. So let's say this is like the mortality rate among people with severe heart disease, right? And we're looking at an entire population here, so even though most people don't have severe heart disease, there's always going to be some sort of stock of people who do. So if you're just looking at it over time, or this is really, it's not even make the mortality rate, but actually let's just say number of deaths. So if you're looking at it over time, it should be relatively constant. Let's just suppose that you have like a large enough population that actually all the random variation pretty much evens out, and it just looks sort of relatively constant over time. Now, what's happening here again, is that you want to think of there's like a stock that's constantly both draining and being replenished. So on the one hand, this should be increasing, like the overall stock of people with severe heart disease should be increasing because on any given day some new people are going to be diagnosed with severe heart disease. On the other hand, it's also going to be decreasing because on any given day some people will be dying from their severe heart disease. And in the steady state, on average, those two things will have to end up offsetting each other, and then you just have this overall stock. So among that stock, there's like a death rate, and so if you multiply the death rate by the stock, then you get the number of deaths. And so this is going to be kind of staying constant over time. And then let's say there's some negative air pollution shock. So for whatever reason, air pollution spikes right around now. So let's say big spike in air pollution. And so then you see this big increase in the number of deaths because a bunch of them, even more so than normal, a bunch of them end up dying. And then what happens after that, so if you just kind of looked at the pattern right here, you would say, okay, clearly air pollution has this very negative impact on mortality. But what happens after that, potentially, in this model at least, is that then the death rate actually goes down, or the number of deaths actually go down for a while. And the reason is that essentially what we think has happened here is that people who were sort of on the margin of dying, who were like just holding on, who would have died a few weeks in the future, their deaths got brought forward because of the big spike in air pollution. But since those deaths got brought forward, there's actually going to be a fall in deaths relative to the normal rate in the subsequent weeks because people who normally would have been dying then have now been already harvested or eliminated. And so the death rate actually falls, and then eventually it gets back up to what the sort of normal steady state is, right? And so if you then were to look at, so if you if you kind of just look at the relationship between air pollution levels, so I'm going to also put like air pollution levels on here and be like, it's a big spike in air pollution, and then maybe it goes back down to normal levels. So if you just looked at the correlation or the relationship between daily air pollution levels and death rates, you would conclude that that air pollution has this negative impact on mortality, or I guess positive impact on mortality, negative impact on health. But the effect of sort of the long run effect of the increase in air pollution on mortality is actually pretty minimal, right? Because all you did was really bring these number of deaths that would have happened in subsequent weeks forward. But if you kind of looked at the overall death rate from say time like week 1 to like say this is like week 20. So if you look at the overall death rate over this full 20-week span, you wouldn't have found that it was any different than during like any other sort of 20-week span where there wasn't a spike in air pollution, right? Because you kind of think about like integrating under this curve to get all the deaths that occurred during this period. You can see that the extra mass that you get up here is offset by the reduction in the mass that you get in subsequent weeks. So that's the idea behind harvesting. Again, sort of like a kind of like a grim use of the term, but it is an important concept, and it's really it's sort of a key problem that any of these studies that are looking at relatively like high frequency changes in pollution, looking at the relationship between those high frequency changes in pollution and mortality, are potentially going to have to face. Now, as you can see, like the solution here would be to try to use much longer time periods that you're looking over, like calculating the mortality rate over 20 weeks or 50 weeks or something like that, rather than just over 1 week. But then you can't really use high frequency changes in pollution. So I mean, I guess the way that that I would assume it came about is if you're like thinking about so I assumed it was sort of from like an agricultural context of like basically I guess it's like the crops have matured and now you're going to harvest them and that's so like I guess the way that I would have viewed it is like that the crops are going to be harvested in a relatively short period. Whenever, so say that like you harvest them in the autumn or something like that, right? So that sometime between like October and November or something, they're all going to be harvested and then they'll all be gone, right? And so sort of the analog here would be like there's a group of individuals who sometime in the not too distant future are all going to die and quote unquote be harvested, and all the air pollution is doing is sort of moving around. The spike in air pollution is doing is like moving around the exact date on which that's going to occur. But if you look far enough in the future, they're all going to be gone. So I mean, I guess it's sort of like the Grim Reaper is coming, but I don't know exactly if that was what people had in mind when they did it, but it is an important concept regardless of the terminology they use. Okay, so on Friday, I'll talk a little bit about the midterm in terms of like material and what's probably useful to study, and then also go over the problems on the old midterms. So certainly you should take a look at those between now and then and see whether or not they make sense to you.